You don't hear much about Bahrain in the British media, do you? And you hear almost nothing about Bahrain's dictatorship, with only the briefest of news reports about its brutal crackdown against protesters. Despite the British media's silence, and indeed the British government's silence on these matters, people have been protesting for 4 years against the Khalifa dictatorship. Specifically, they're campaigning against human rights abuses and the torture and killing of protesters. The administration in Bahrain uses colourful language to describe the peaceful human rights protesters. Those in charge describe these protesters and journalists as terrorists. Despite this, Bahrain has powerful friends, many of them the very countries who claim to be the standard bearers for human rights, the United States and Britain. In January 2015, Britain's Foreign Secretary even declared Bahrain a country which is travelling in the right direction. Perhaps it's no coincidence that Britain also sells hundreds of millions of pounds in weapons to Bahrain, and it also wants a permanent naval base there. All this raises obvious questions about British hypocrisy when it comes to human rights. After all, why is so much missing in Western coverage of events in Bahrain? How should allies of a country which describes peaceful protesters and journalists as terrorists themselves be described? And what are we to make of Britain's sale of arms to an administration which has such a poor human rights record? These are the simple questions we sought to answer. And we began with a fundamental question. How much do people here in London actually know about the current political situation in Bahrain? Here's what we found out.
I didn't even actually know there was a country called Bahrain, so I actually don't know anything at present, to tell you the truth.
I don't actually know anything about the political situation in Bahrain. I'd never even heard of it until this weekend, and I met someone whose family moved to America because they weren't actually happy with the situation there. They didn't feel safe.
Well, I know there's a bit of political field going on in Bahrain, and when you look at it, the citizens are not really happy with the current government at the moment, and it's like them trying to get rid of the government, but it just can't happen.
I know where Bahrain is. I know did it used to be part of Iran, I think, but actually no, I don't really know anything except Middle East countries are in a bit of a turmoil, and I don't know whether ISIS has got any connection with that or not.
I can't call myself an expert, but I know, throughout the Middle East there's been a lot of disorder, and I'm imagining from the fact that you're talking to me that sort of spread to Bahrain, which I think was, traditionally considered one of the more moderate countries in the Gulf area. But of course, as with a lot of those countries, moderation sort of goes as far as what's convenient for the ruling family. So again, can't call myself an expert, but I'm imagining the sort of disorder in the Middle East is sort of spread there from other places.
I don't know very much about it, to be honest. Just new things you hear on the BBC, but really nothing of any value or any substance.
I know vaguely actions that happened about 2 years ago. I remember the F1 riots, and I was looking at stuff on YouTube. There was people dragging tyres into the street and burning them. I understand that people aren't happy with the royalty there, the regime there.
I know that Bahrain was in the news a lot during the Arab Spring. It's the normal protests, which I presume were put down by the Bahraini government. Beyond that, not much.
I don't know anything about it at the moment.
Why is that?
I guess it's not covered in the news. I haven't learned anything about it at university, really.
So what is there to know about Bahrain and the current political situation there? We asked our experts.
Current political situation in Bahrain is that we still have a ruler who controls the entire authorities, control the wealth of the country, and not willing to sit on a table to have a dialogue with the opposition. This ruler is supported by his family only, which is Khalifa family. He does not represent any part of the Bahraini people population. And we look at the other side. Opposition is representing majority of the people who demand transforming the current tribal rule to a democratic rule.
I've been following the situation in Bahrain for many years through my role as Vice Chair of the All-Party Human Rights Group in the British Parliament and as frequent attender at the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva. And I have a lot of contact with the Bahrain groups who are concerned about the issue of Saudi involvement in Bahrain, but also the suppression of demonstrations and the numbers of people that are still in prison having taken part in those demonstrations. My purpose is to try and achieve freedom of speech for people in Bahrain. How well does the mainstream British media keep the public informed about the situation in Bahrain, and what's missing from the coverage? We asked the public what they thought.
It seems that sort of celebrity culture has taken more of a place than actual news about faraway countries. Obviously, where we have a invested interest, places like Saudi Arabia, I'd say we tend to conceal certain things, but I think we don't really hear about much about Bahrain because we probably don't have much interest in their country's welfare.
Well, I haven't seen any coverage of Bahrain. There were a couple of segments on it during the original Arab Spring uprising, but other than that, it's been mostly ignored. Once again, mainly because I think that the Western governments are currently content with the situation in Bahrain. And as we have seen in the past, like we supported Batista in Cuba, we supported Perón in Chile. We don't really care about human rights when it comes down to it.
Our news, it kind of focuses on what's happening in our country more than what's going on in the rest of the world, I guess. Unless it's massive tourism or like terrorism.
Terrorism.
Thank you, I can't get the word out. Then when that gets mentioned, that's the only time I suppose it comes into our news.
They just want us to see what's going on. Not everything they want that they want the citizens to know. So take, for example, it's all about the Muslims, the Islamists, the ISIS, the Al-Qaedas. That's what they want to show us. They believe what is newsworthy is what they want the citizens to know. They don't want the citizens to know what's going on in other countries because to them it's not newsworthy.
I think there's a large part of the media that sees the Arab Spring as over. And obviously that's had an important legacy within Bahrain, I presume, as it has other Middle Eastern states. So yeah, I think there's a reluctance. The media doesn't cover Syria much anymore unless you're watching Al Jazeera. So yeah, I guess in their view we might have lost interest.
How good is the performance of the British media regarding Bahrain? Do they regularly miss out events in their coverage? Our expert said this.
I think the British media is not covering Bahraini situation as normal, like when it happened in Egypt or Libya or Yemen or Syria. In fact, they play a negative role when it comes to Bahrain. They don't cover, and when they cover, they say it is a Shia opposition, not a Bahraini opposition. They're trying to color it with a sectarian color. Plus, they don't recognize the opposition as a legitimate opposition. We don't see British media covering in a positive way to support a democratic transformation and support the human rights issues in Bahrain.
I think the British media could be much better informed about the situation in Bahrain, but there is some coverage. More recently, the coverage was firstly of the Saudi involvement a couple of years back when they sent large numbers of troops across the causeway into Bahrain itself. A lot of opposition to the Formula One race being held in Bahrain because that's seen as a public relations coup for the government of Bahrain at the expense of the ordinary people. And more recently, the British government's rather strange view that by opening a military base in Bahrain, it somehow or other assists the development of human rights. And in questions that I put to the Foreign Secretary on this matter in Parliament, he said that he thought Bahrain was travelling in the right direction. The following day, the leader of the opposition was arrested and is still in prison. That cannot be acceptable. For the last 4 years, people in Bahrain have campaigned against the Khalifa dictatorship, its human rights abuses, the torture and killing of protesters. How would people here in London describe a country like that?
That they've got to protest against it. It's pretty horrible that you think with this day and age that something like that actually wouldn't exist anymore. It's quite sad to think that countries still have that type of management, I guess, with all the human rights that we have these days. You know, there's been so much movement to give us all freedom and independence, and it's really sad that there's countries that don't have that.
Well, it doesn't sound right. It doesn't sound like their human rights are being respected, and obviously it's not the way that the Western world looks at a place that is somewhere that someone would want to live, because you need to be able to express yourself and your opinion.
Well, I think they're happening in a lot of other countries in the Middle East, so I think it's not surprising. It is surprising, obviously, that we haven't heard about it. I think it's one of those situations that's probably like a bit more underground. Their uprisings are probably like a big deal, but maybe they're not big enough for the media to cover, or I don't know. It is obviously shocking that it's happening and we're not hearing about it.
Well, it is certainly, as with the other countries which have suffered or gone through the Arab Spring, it is certainly a country in chaos. It is an issue that, well, as with the wide Arab Spring, needs to be solved internationally. There needs to be more investigations into the human rights abuses. There needs to be more action taken by Western governments. However, as I said before, it is very difficult because the current situation is in favor of our government. So without, I guess, more civilian support from Western nations for a change in the government's policy towards Bahrain, I don't think you can see any change happening because we're very content.
So varying responses from the public. Perhaps our experts are able to provide an appropriate description of a country with Bahrain's human rights record.
I would say Bahrain become a backyard for Saudi, fully controlled by Saudi. Al Khalifa is serving Saudi and West agenda in Bahrain. They're not willing to listen to the Bahraini people. And that's why the Bahraini people is not giving them legitimacy. Their legitimacy basically is coming from the outside support instead of from within support. I would say it's a family ruling a country with a West support instead of the people support, and that's why the violation is growing day and day, because that's the agenda of the outsider. The ruler is not coming, is not elected, is not having legitimacy from people, and he's willing to oppress and kill and torture people to serve the outside agenda.
I think it's a country under huge stress. It's under stress because it has a political system that is clearly not representative of all of the people of Bahrain. It has a government that's obsessed with its own position and therefore oppresses demonstrators. It has obviously access to enormous wealth. It obviously has a very close political relationship with Western Europe and the USA, hence the problems over the base that is being constructed there and the way in which it has become, in a sense, a political tool of the West in the way that much of its foreign policy is developed. I think there's also an issue in Bahrain, and indeed every other country in the region, about the numbers of migrant workers and their lack of political and civil rights, which are something that is basic within international human rights law through the United Nations Human Rights Convention. Bahrain refers to peaceful human rights activists and journalists as terrorists. How would the public describe allies of a country which uses that kind of language against peaceful protesters?
It's not good at all, really. Like, why should we support someone that's not giving anyone human rights? And like, Britain's such a massive, I suppose, country. Like, it has a say in a lot of things, and to think that it's supporting a country that is pulling away everyone's rights, it's not really good at all.
Like most, Britain's been an ally of a lot of dictatorships. Britain's been an ally to a lot of, like, the Shah in Iran was backed by America, backed by the UK, like in general, it's not surprising. So no, I don't know how I feel about it, but it's not surprising.
I don't agree with it. I mean, I think that people should have freedom of speech and should be allowed to say what they want without fear of of being abused for it.
Well, I think obviously Britain needs to rethink this or re-examine their relationship, because they obviously don't have the ideas or the same feelings about the same issues. Obviously free speech is incredibly important to the rest of the Western world, and if they're describing that as terrorism, it's a bit scary, to be honest. There's no other way to put it.
Last question.
Well, I'm afraid I don't know. I don't approve of a lot of the things that Britain does at the moment. I was one of these people who went on the anti-Iraqi war demonstration on that cold February day. I'm not a great fan of a lot of what Britain does at the moment.
I would say it's important to realise it's not just Bahrain, but Saudi, America, Israel, we're allies with lots of despotic regimes. I think, yes, it's despicable that, we do have allegiances with despots, but yeah, it's not just Bahrain, and obviously the reasons why we've got these allegiances are even worse, looking at oil and arms being the primary motivators, I'm assuming.
What are we to make of those countries which back Bahrain, despite its harsh criticism of peace activists and journalists? Our experts shared their view.
I think Bahrain allies, who are mainly Britain and United States, are supporting the wrong government and the wrong regime. A regime who claim that human rights activists, journalists are terrorists. This regime have no manner and have no good faith, and wanted just to crush a peaceful people with any claim. We see them as a supporter of an oppressive regime, a supporter of a regime who have no legitimacy from people.
Journalists are not free to operate in Bahrain. Protesters risk everything by making a demonstration on the streets. I was astonished that the Bahrain government put out a whole lot of propaganda a couple of days ago saying everything was all peaceful in Bahrain, there's nobody demonstrating on the streets. Maybe they weren't. They weren't demonstrating because somebody had been arrested for demonstrating before. And the medical people that have treated victims of all problems, irrespective of the political views of the victims, have been imprisoned as a result of it. And the continued detention of the opposition leader does not indicate a respect for democracy or the wishes of the ordinary people of Bahrain. And sadly, the approval of the government of Bahrain by the United States and Britain particularly undermines the whole cause of human rights and justice in Bahrain. Britain has described Bahrain as a country travelling in the right direction. It has sold Bahrain hundreds of millions of pounds of weapons and wants a permanent naval base there. We invited the public to consider Britain's so-called concern for human rights in that context.
It seems to be the case in recent years, certainly with everything that's going on in Syria, everything that happened in Iraq. It seems to be we'll go in when we want something or when we think that we can kind of angle it in the public eye that we're actually working in their best interests. But it's clearly not the case, as has been discovered by people like you, I guess.
It is more so, it comes down purely to international politics, and the only thing that the Western governments are concerned with is what is happening in the West. They couldn't care less because we want stability in the West. We want the power that we get from having these alliances, and we want these iron rulers to stay in power in the Middle East because they're the only ones who keep the population suppressed.
Well, to be honest, it clearly shows that there isn't much consistency, that there are things that happen like that all the time. To be fair, that's not the first time I've heard that Britain sold weapons to dictatorships or I mean, lots of dictatorships were throughout history maintained by the British, by the US. They've sold arms to them, so it's not the first time, it probably won't be the last. So yeah, it clearly shows that the UK has one interest in mind and maybe human rights come second.
I think it's awful. I think it's a huge deception of trust. I mean, with the general election coming up, I mean, all the main parties are going to want to not talk about, you know, how our country's funded. I mean, since colonialism, we've always sought to overseas exploitation to better our own ends. I think the double standards are huge.
I mean, again, knowing that the current government have quite a fast and loose relationship with human rights, I'm not surprised. I don't think they'd be unwilling to compromise that, to compromise like current human rights, the status of human rights currently in this country, in order to make a quick buck. Especially when you consider that like weapons trading, arms trading. I mean, apparently we're one of the biggest arms trading countries in the world, if not the biggest.
With Britain's evident interest in military trade with Bahrain and positive comments about its direction, we invited our experts to summarise what this tells us about Britain's true attitude towards human rights.
The Britain Parliament have recommended that Bahrain should be on the concerned list. And since then, we haven't seen any move from the government to put Bahrain on the concerned list. And instead, they were supporting Bahrain by all means, on all levels. And Mr. Hammond's statement that Bahrain is moving in the right direction is another lie. He is trying to cover the shame of British government who support such regime, a dictatorship, by saying that. He is trying to make this ally, which is Bahrain, moving into the right direction, because he have no answer when it comes to where is the solution for the political situation in Bahrain.
The Foreign Secretary used the words Bahrain travelling in the right direction in answer to a question from me in the British Parliament. I was very surprised at this because there is no indication that Bahrain is travelling in the right direction. Read the Universal Periodic Review on human rights in Bahrain, read the Amnesty and other reports of what's happening in Bahrain, and look at the numbers of people in prison, and then look at the arms sales to Bahrain and, crucially, the sale of anti-personnel equipment to Bahrain, which was condemned by the Foreign Affairs Select Committee in the British Parliament, and indeed Bahrain appears on the Foreign Office own website as a country of concern. So where the Foreign Secretary gets this view from that Bahrain is travelling in the right direction, I've no idea. I think it's self-serving, what he said. It's all about selling arms and getting a base built, which British and presumably American ships will also operate from. They're more interested in a naval presence in the Gulf than they are in human rights in Bahrain.
Bahrain clearly has a poor human rights record. It even describes peaceful protesters and journalists who campaign on these issues as terrorists. Yet Britain supports Bahrain and has sold hundreds of millions of pounds of arms to its rulers. This may be good for business, but it's very bad for freedom. Worst of all, it's clear and compelling evidence that Britain is happy to pursue its own self-interest in the Middle East, regardless of the double standards when it comes to human rights. Double standards which amount to nothing less than hypocrisy.